Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Inside SailTrek SOC. My name is Ria. I am your host, and I'm very pleased to welcome my friend, Katherine Parker-Magyar. She is a travel writer from, some of the most amazing publications around the face of the planet. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm a travel writer. I've been to 65 countries, all 50 states. And I write for a variety of publications, like my work's been in the Daily Beast, Forbes, Business Insider, The Week. And yeah, so I'm excited to talk all things travel in 2021 because, this is a subject that almost changes every day, but it's definitely been a really interesting time to be in the travel industry for sure.
Well, I had a conversation with you last year and or maybe it was earlier this year, but we were just talking about the fact that, and actually, I think at that time, you hadn't done much traveling because, of course, everything was shut down. But you are now moving and you are now starting to get out there and getting around again. How exciting is that for you?
I mean, it's amazing. I think that a lot of people can relate to this, but being at home or just not being exposed to like a larger array of humanity, like and reading the news, watching the news, it can really depress you and just sort of make you forget that like overall like people in the world are good. And like I was in the Maldives about a month ago and just leaving the country and like meeting all these new people and learning more about this history of a part of the world I've never been to before. And I found Maldivian people were so kind and like really fun and just, I never met a Maldivian person before. And that for me was like the thing that I missed. And I left and because I always feel like what unites us is so much bigger than what divides us. Like I feel like I can make friends anywhere. And, it's re-sparked in me an excitement and a faith in humanity. Because when you just read the news and I think Mark Twain put it best. He was like, pretty much travel is fatal to hatred, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. Like mankind or womankind can't develop like a charitable view of the world in their own little corner. And I think that's really true. So just after feeling so locked up, going to the Maldives was amazing. But it definitely requires more layers of like just more steps in terms of health and safety, which I almost on a much broader scale linked to like after September 11th, flying out of New York City, you just had a couple more steps, and even globally after the shoe bomber in Britain, I remember there were extra steps. So it's just like, you just have to accept that. And that's just to keep you safe. But
those things carried on as well too, didn't they? Like they've never stopped. They've carried on and they're just part of the process. We don't complain about it. We realize this is why it happened and we just accept it.
Yes. And just as a travel writer, I'd forgotten that there was a travel element to my job just because when we talked, I was in Wyoming and I did a fair amount. Like I was based in Wyoming and I traveled to Big Sky, Montana and to Aspen, Colorado. And those were during I was distanced, you're more isolated, like you were able to you can stay in your own cabin. And the national parks and road trips have really taken off this past year. Yeah. And there's this summer, it's still a zoo. I was wondering, because 2020, tourism has had a banner year in Wyoming, Montana, a lot of these places with national park and really beautiful natural beauty that I'm excited that more Americans have discovered. But I was thinking, okay, 2020, this is going to be a showstopper. And just because borders are open now in 2021, I was wondering if it would shift a bit, but no, still Yellowstone is flooded, Jackson Hole is flooded. So part of me, I do hope that this sort of reinterest in America's national parks. Growing up, my family did cross-country road trips. I collected national park cards. I'm actually editing a site that's launching called US Travelers League. It's all about visiting all 50 states. And this was something that I grew up loving and knowing. And it always fascinated me, being on the East Coast and someone's been to the Alps, but not the Rockies. And I think that, that is part of what actually really does make America great, our national parks. But yeah, I guess what I was saying when I said traveling and writing, I just feel that I was I can't believe this is my job. I just had an overwhelming sense of this is crazy. I'm in the Maldives right now for work because hadn't done it in 15 months. And before that, I was traveling so regularly, and it's not like I ever lost sight of how cool my job was. But, fundamentally, I always think of myself as a writer. And I think, people talk about how their productivity sparked or decreased during the pandemic. Mine definitely went up and down. But just being able to travel again for work, I was like, okay, I love what I do. This is great. So yeah, for me, it was a really positive experience.
Let me ask you, I mean, as far as people go, I know that some of the experiences that we weren't able to have throughout the lockdowns around the world, when you're traveling now, do you find that people have a little bit more patience when they're getting on the plane or when they're standing in line? Do you find that when you are actually being a tourist, as it were, that other people are just enjoying it that much more because of the year that we weren't able to do much?
So I think that what separates like a vacationer from a traveler is being able to handle with grace the act of traveling. And I would say that I've noticed vacationers definitely seem happier. Like you make conversation with anyone and people are just like, like a stranger, like, or I'm having a Mai Tai by the pool. But for actual traveling and travelers, like I haven't seen that. I mean, now that there are several airlines that won't serve alcohol on flights because passengers have gotten rowdier. I think people are so pent up with all their energy, or that people have actually, I think traveling is a bit like a skill. And I think some people maybe have lost it. I mean, I enjoyed it, but like, so in the Maldives, I slept in an airport hotel. I probably was on 6 or 7 flights, 4 or 5 major, cross Indian Ocean boat rides. And I enjoyed it. And but you settle back into it, because it's part of the process. But I think it's twofold, where airlines are struggling, where they had, no passengers, and then suddenly they have an overflow, and people are also struggling with employing the correct amount of people. Everything is just so up in the air, like that. I don't know. I haven't seen for myself really bad attitude out on the road or up in the sky, but I know that that's something that's happening because it's being reported, and because all of these US airlines are like, they're afraid to serve booze. I forget what article it was in, but I was reading this story with like just a bunch of like accounts from different flight attendants who just like more violence on flights, and also people who are refusing to wear their mask on a plane. A travel writer friend of mine, the plane she was flying from Miami to Denver, and a man on the flight wouldn't put his mask on, and they had to return and touch back down in Miami again. Like they had to turn the flight around. So I think, we'll talk about this in terms of like, we are still in a pandemic, like health guidance and sort of how to be a good traveler, and also just what to expect when you're traveling somewhere. I think that it was eye-opening because I'm going to Bonaire in next weekend. Maldives is my first international trip. And there is more of a process in terms of like, for me, when I landed, even though I was with other travel writers and like the Maldives Tourism Bureau was aware, the Maldives was aware I was coming. I was nervous in line that like one of my documents wouldn't be all set. So I think having that kind of transparency and just recognizing it will be a little bit more stressful. If you can get vaccinated, get vaccinated. If you like to travel, you need to get vaccinated, because that's the biggest determiner, because hotels now too, like particularly in the Caribbean, which is still open, individual hotels are now also going to require that people have been vaccinated. And I'm telling you, like eventually, I think when enough of us do get vaccinated and COVID goes the way of the yellow fever, we'll carry our COVID vaccine card, just like people carry their yellow card, that things will change. But until then, like, you're going to need the double proof of the double vaccination and the negative PCR test. And for me, I love my vaccine card, because it, in some instances, not all, negates me having to go get a PCR test within 96 hours of my flight taking off, which sounds like really easy, and it kind of is, but PCR tests can take 2 or 3 days to issue results, so until you fly, you worry, and then you're like, well, what if I kind of have it? But people need to comply. And like also a lot of these places that are opening and that are open, like it's so tenuous that all it takes is someone to carry the disease. And a lot of these places don't have, a lot of the countries we're visiting from America, we have too many vaccines. We have more than enough vaccines, more vaccines that people will take. but a lot of these countries too, and I factor this in when I'm writing about where to travel, they don't have, they don't have the vaccine supply and they don't have the hospital beds. So it's just a matter of like being a good human being too.
Well, and as far as when you travel, I mean, I would imagine that because nobody's truly on the same page, no matter whether it be an airline, whether it be a country, it could be from state to state, from province to province. Nobody is truly on the same page when it comes to how you can fly, what documents you need. So it's probably really wise to contact your airline or the different airlines, because a lot of times when you're traveling overseas, you're traveling through 2 or 3 different airlines, depending on how many planes you take.
Yes.
So to know what the rules and regulations are prior to taking off, instead of getting halfway to where you're going, having to board a new carrier and not having the stuff done that you're supposed to have done.
But that's such a smart point. And I should have said that earlier too. Like, so I flew Qatar Airways to the Maldives. So you have a release form that you need for Qatar, because, and usually I'm a huge fan of do a really long layover and explore the city. Like I would have loved to explore Doha, but I didn't leave the Doha airport because as long as I was within the airport in Qatar, that I didn't need to like get all of if I left, I don't know, it would have been harder for me to come back because, your things, particularly when you're flying with an airline and you have a stopover in multiple countries, it's valid for the duration of your flight. But so the easiest way really to do it is, check the airline. You can find it, like those forms are pretty apparent. And it's usually just like an arrival and a departure form is what I needed for Qatar Airways. And then you need to if you go to the CDC website, they will often link to the travel requirements for the specific country. Like they'll tell you their recommendation and then they'll send you to the link. But if not, if you go to the tourism website, just Google like St. Bart's Tourism Bureau. If you go there, they always have everything because that's like, it's the CDC of travelers. So they'll have the form that you need to fill in. But I think every country is doing it differently in my experience. So for Bonaire, where I'm going next week, I'm double vaccinated. I'm showing a negative PCR test. I've got to get that done during the week and then I can go. For the Maldives, because the Maldives, I don't know how many people, listeners have gone or haven't gone. It's definitely worth a visit. It's like the Caribbean. It's the Caribbean of Europe in a way, because, though they don't have, obviously we've got Mallorca, which we guys in right now, and you have these beautiful beaches, but in terms of like the white sands and the aquamarine waters, that kind of landscape doesn't really exist. And in the Maldives, it's like these islands are, when you fly over them, they're all atolls, which are, these different islands on one chain that were from an underwater volcano. And it's insane. It's just, you go over and you see hundreds of islands and some are very far apart. Like it was an hour flight to our first island in the Maldives. But all of these islands and like what they're famous for, and it's similar in a way to a cruise ship, but highly elevated, where everything exists on the resort islands for you. It's one island, one resort. So, when I was in Luxembourg Malay Atoll, it was the entire everything. You are like the VIP guest. Everything. It's not like there's a downtown or like but also though the Maldives is now like they have a push to share more of Maldivian culture, which I definitely wanted to learn more about. But because of COVID, like I couldn't explore Malé, which is the capital, and it wasn't recommended to stay at a guest house. They have local islands and tourist islands. So local islands are where people live, and they'll have guest houses there where people can stay. And I think that would be really cool. But a lot of these islands were either uninhabited or they were picnic islands, which is like people would go just for the day. And so the hotel groups, they all lease from the Maldivian government for a certain number of years. So, and they have this great mandate where I think it's 40 or 50% need to be of workers need to be Maldivian. They have things in place where Maldivian people are going to be more rising in the executive ranks, which is great because, as with the Maldivian people I spoke to, which was like always I asked this question, because this happened in the last 30 years where Maldives suddenly became a tourist spot. And it's like, how did you like it? Like, how does it feel? Because if you're like 40 or 50 or 60, you remember. And even if you're my age, if you're like in your 30s, you remember when it wasn't a big deal. And people do really like it because before, you know, there is not a huge economy within the Maldives and some of these islands. So people would have to go live abroad to work. And now, like, I think they've handled the tourism really well there. I mean, the Maldives Tourism Bureau had a conference underwater, which is so scary because we'll lose the Maldives in 100 years or so. Because if the sea rises 1.5 feet, I think, or then the Maldives is gone, and we think it's going to rise about 2 feet. Don't quote me. Don't quote me. But that was a long preamble into saying each island in the Maldives, in order to travel, you have to show a negative test before getting there and a negative test before leaving. So that is how they've really contained it. And for some people, it's like, I understand people like the tests are annoying, but they're really not. Like, it's such a machine now. Like, I did my test. So I got tested all in, I guess, 4 times in a week, but you do it in the hotel lobby. They just how it's like what I was saying, one island, one resort. It's not on you, which is what I feel like a lot of the COVID procedures can be so stressful. Like, I got to find this form. I got to do this. Like, they know that you didn't have COVID when you came. They know where you're going next. They're going to make sure you got tested. They're going to make sure your results are in on time. They're going to send it to the next place. Like, so even though you definitely had to take more, but that was the only thing that felt different. More COVID tests. That was it. Like, everything else, people were indoor, outdoors. You had to wear a mask in one place walking into the snack bar, but because they're always able to verify that everyone on the islands at all times has either arrived negative, or if their staffers have been negative in the past couple of days, it really is a blissful COVID-free world. It really is.
So realistically, what you're saying then is that, as the time passes and people get used to the rules and regulations, it's just becoming easier, and it will just become second nature. The same as after 9/11, the same as after the shoe bomber, the same as after any other issue that we've ever had when it comes to travel. It's just a matter of people getting used to the rules and regulations and understanding them properly, and things will run smoother, and we can expect things to just get back to the new normal. I hate saying that because everybody says the new normal, but we are going to be able to travel the way we always have been. It's just going to be with a few extra steps involved. Right?
My prediction is that the hardest it's going to be, it's just going to be within like the next year or two, as people have to account for the fact that the vaccine hasn't been widely distributed. But I think that once we do have a majority of populations in these countries having been vaccinated, I suspect that we won't be required to be doing the negative PCR test on top of the vaccination identification. I think it's going to be like yellow fever, where I don't need to submit a negative yellow fever test. I just have to show my yellow fever vaccination. But that obviously is going to rest on getting enough of the world vaccinated before this thing mutates to the longer. I don't want to shame America. I do. American listeners who are unvaccinated, like, the longer that we have an unvaccinated population and the disease passes from person to person, it's going to get stronger. But, when you do get vaccinated, even if you do get it and transmit it, the likelihood of it being a serious illness is very small, or hospitalization is small. So that's where I think that we'll end up. Until then, I think that we are going to have to be doing the precautionary steps of really just showing the negative PCR test within 96 hours, which isn't the most efficient way, in my opinion, just because, there's a 2 to 3, it's the best thing we can do. But, there can be a 2 to 3 delay on getting PCR versus rapid results. But a lot of airports, including one in, oh wow, Katie, I think it's either Bonaire or it is St. Lucia. I think it's Bonaire. I think it's Flamingo Airport, and Bonaire is now, they have different, but it's airports everywhere. JFK have on-site testing. So that makes things really easy. So even if always, if you're traveling internationally, arrive early, but particularly now, because when I was flying to the Middle East, there were people in line who, some of them didn't have every element in terms of, they didn't have their negative PCR test. And they were like, okay, well, if you go over to this wing, you'll have it within 45 minutes. So just, allow a buffer time for things to potentially go wrong. But It's been my
But
experience.
there is a difference too. There's two tests. There's the antigen test and the PCR test. Now the PCR test is the one that takes, blood tests, whatever 3 days or 48 hours or whatever. And the antigen test, you can have those results within half an hour.
And they have those.
Yeah, and I know that there's even, I've seen people talking, they're coming up with tests all the time, and they're coming up with more and more rapid tests. I saw somewhere some scientists have developed a new test where they literally, it's like a diabetic, where they prick your finger, they get your blood, and within 5 minutes, you have a result. Science will figure it out, and we will.
Sounds like Theranos. That sounds like Elizabeth Holmes' company where you prick your finger and if you had all the diseases that turned out to be a scam. But this makes sense. You can identify one disease.
Who knows, right? I don't know. I mean, the scientists are trying all sorts of things, and I think it's going to, move along faster, and we will probably have, within a year or so, something that's a little bit quicker as far as the actual PCR test that takes 48 hours right now. We might have a test that comes out that is a lot faster. But right now it is what it is.
And I think that, and it's smart to cover like the inconveniences and sort of negative impact that this has had on travel. But I do think there are also positive ones, like revenge travel is something that's become very popular. I haven't been able to go anywhere in a year and a half. Like I've always wanted to go on safari, or I've always wanted to like hike the Himalayas. I've always wanted to see Antarctica. Like Antarctica cruises are sold out for the next 2 years because people are finally like, I know. Maybe, but I hope maybe they've released more seats. But I read about that really recently, and that fascinated me because I was supposed to go to Antarctica fall 2019, but I couldn't go because of timing. And I think about it a lot. And I realized that's like a travel writer. Like I'm sure other people are thinking about other places, you know what I mean? Or like India. And so I think that we are going to see a huge boom in travel. And hopefully I always say, like, you're never going to have the right amount of money or the right amount of time. And it doesn't require as much money or time to travel as people really, really think it does. Like, I thought going to Kenya was a $15,000 endeavor when I was saving money in my 20s with like my friend Alex. But then her dad turned like 50 and they all went to Kenya. And I was like so angry because I was like, when will I go now? Am I going to have to be on my honeymoon? This is before I was a travel writer. Then, I have now gone all over the world, and you see how much each hotel is paying per night. And some places, like you would think Kenya would be a more expensive trip than Stockholm, but it's not. You know what I mean? Like it's really about getting the flight deals. And now you can do amazing flight deals. Like for example, like New Zealand, you can book a lot of places. You can book a flight, put it off, because they need bookings. That's changing. That will change. But I think that for international destinations, unfortunately, also places where COVID is not very few places are on the decline, but where COVID is either sparking or not going to go in anytime soon. But if it's a dream trip of yours, I would start looking into travel deals for it now, because you are going to be able to find some. And then another good trend is, as a freelance writer, I've always sort of worked from my laptop the past 4 years, wherever I am. Pluses and minuses to it. Minus is like, definitely, I think everyone has discovered the going crazy when you're isolated and it's just you and your work. But the positive is that you have this flexibility. And so this idea that, you're going to go away from Friday to Sunday, or you're going to just take a weekend somewhere, is sort of becoming outdated, not only because I think if there's like a moral and a health risk that you feel while traveling, like, oh my God, like if you're someone who is very scared of transmitting, which is smart, I think I'm much less afraid because I've been vaccinated, I'll get a booster shot. But if there's a moral barrier to travel, a health barrier, people don't want to do these quick turnaround trips. They want to make it worth it. And if you can work remotely, as a lot of companies are now saying, you can work in the office 2 or 3 days a week. People now have the opportunity, and as a travel writer, I've traveled like this a lot of times. Like I'm on vacation, but then I've got some days where I've got to write a story, but it's really fun to like write it from your villa in like the Florida Keys, than it is to write it from your apartment. So longer trips, I think we're going to see more of, particularly like usually the summer the travel booms are around really summertime, particularly like August. And then in the holidays and then the spring break. So it goes like the biggest is obviously, well, it depends. If you're in the Caribbean, then the biggest is going to be around the holidays. But shoulder season is really underrated season to travel in the spring and fall, particularly like if you're going September or May, because you're getting pretty much the same weather at 50% less cost, and I think that that's always been sort of a more insidery travel tip that I think is going to be in the mainstream as people realize that they don't need to, these places are staying open for longer now to accommodate like Positano and the Amalfi Coast. Like it doesn't just suddenly become winter there on September 2nd. So that's going to also be a good change, sort of seeing maybe more fluid travel around the, like all year round. And for the 1%, like 0.001%, I think that the hotel takeovers, the villas, the emphasis on privacy will stay too, because I think that hotels are also seeing that this is like an offering that they can do, that people want to do. And they've still seen an appetite for it, even as the risk has gone down. But like, do you want to rent out like this entire block of cottages for you and your friends and family? Or jet share, private plane share companies are doing really well, like off the charts. So, and there's different versions of this. Like there's Blade on the East Coast in New York, where you can like take a helicopter to the Hamptons or Millbrook. But I think that's something that'll be interesting and innovative. And like, just for me, from a personal perspective, like I think that sounds great. I would love if it would go down. The price would go down, but as more companies build, maybe the price will go down. I mean, I just had a moment of thinking about the environment, but we're not talking about that today, obviously. But and that is one thing that I do think has changed for the better, is that I think people are more aware of their carbon footprint, like all those memes, like, oh, the earth is healed. You know what I mean? Like the things people are seeing in their outside their New York City apartments. And I think people felt that everywhere, is that when we weren't on the road as much, when we weren't moving around as much, like we did see an immediate almost animals come in to reclaim some spaces. I think that there's always been an interest in eco travel and green travel, but I think that is definitely becoming more and more prominent. And I think that's also because the pandemic has caused a lot of like different awakenings too. Obviously climate change was before this, but also with Black Lives Matter and this emphasis on, deconstructing a colonial mindset around travel and like locally owned places. And for me, like, I hate being in like a huge corporate hotel that is owned by a Texan who's maybe living in Holland, and it's like a huge chain. I always really, really like boutique hotels. And a lot of boutique hotels, it's hard in some countries where tourism is relatively new, or where the country itself is relatively new, or where like the structures of the economy and the society has changed recently, to find many hotel owners. But that's also because you're also, like in the Maldives, for example, like a lot of these people are like being trained in hospitality now, but you can also identify places where the majority of the staff is local, or it's not hard to look into whether or not a hotel you're staying at is a productive contributor to society. Like even in Cancun, when I was staying there at a hotel there, it was, oh my God, Katie, it's been a while and I don't remember its name and I feel horrible. Okay. But they have like an entire program that brings in like inner city kids in Mexico, and they like get to stay at the resort for free, and they're always doing food. So there are ways, I think tourism can be on a micro level like that, a force for good, but on a larger level, I've hiked in the Andes and places and communities that are like, no cell phone service, no Wi-Fi, like, and it's pretty much communism above like 16,000 feet, but all the money from the tourism goes into building schools and keeping this way of life alive. And there are ways that you can travel that's like be an ethical travel, that's traveler beyond just being green, but with the local communities. And just based on the articles I've seen written, a lot of inside baseball-ish type tourism stories that have made it, in the New York Times Travel about how tourism bureaus, like how diverse are the offerings they're showing, like how many restaurants and hotels are, if it's a city like Charleston that has a substantial Black population, how many Black owned restaurants or hotels are working with the tourism boards. So I think that level of accountability hopefully doesn't go away. I think it's definitely a definite shift there that's also good.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see how you fare, because you do have this trip coming up shortly, and I'm sure that as your job is a travel writer, you're going to be having many more. We'll have to have you back in another 6 months or so and see how your latest trips have sort of evolved, and how travel in general has evolved within the next 6 months.
Yeah, that would be great. I'll do dispatches.
Yeah. If you're coming to this place, this is what you have to expect.
And maybe the process will be entirely different too. I mean, I was going to maybe be in Zambia this past weekend by my friend's wedding. And I really want to, I think it's interesting too in Africa too, with some of these, I know we touched on the outdoors, but some of these safari companies and stuff like have been able to maintain, COVID-free environments. And I mean, tourism is so important to the economy. but I wonder if travel streaming will come back, you know. It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see in the next couple months how things progress and whether or not we still have to do the PCR test or if we can do the antigen test at the airport. We'll see.
Yeah, well, it's definitely interesting times we live in. But I think, as you said before, you know, people have, I think human beings, if we're ever told that we can't do something, it makes us want to do it even so much more. And as well, what 2020 taught us is that we can do our jobs. The economy can continue, not necessarily tourism, but many jobs can continue without having to go into the office every day. So that opens up the world of travel even, you know, larger to a larger population. Katherine, I want to say thank you ever so much for your time.
Thank you. This was so much fun. Always great to chat with you.
Well, it's always a pleasure to host you. Once again, I want to say thank you to our viewers. You have been listening to Katherine Parker-Magyar. She is a travel journalist for many magazines and all sorts of things around the world. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. We're going to have her back after she does a little bit more traveling in the future so we can find out what it's like. You've been watching another edition of Inside SailTrek SOC. My name is Ria. I have been your host. We'll see you again next week.